Hey everybody, Tom Barnes, stories from the 78, and I'm going to the north side of Chicago, right on the border perhaps between Rogers Park and Evanston, and that's where I got my friend here, Daniel. How are you, sir?
Doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to talk to you. You've written some gigantic pieces of work that many people might know, especially The Shape of Water and others. But you're working with George A. Romero's. How do you go about explaining working with like the estate and writing a book that you kind of found? I'll let you tell the whole story. I don't want to step on your toes
Yeah,
there.
I mean, I would say I'm working with the estate. And
Hmm.
when I say that, it's not like I'm working with a giant, multinational corporation. That really means his wife Suze and his manager Chris, and that's more or less it. It's just a very small group of people. That is the Romero estate, really. But yeah, this is the second book I've finished for George Romero. So essentially, when he died in 2017, he left two unfinished novels behind. So obviously, he was a very famous filmmaker and tried his hand twice at a novel, and both
Hmm.
were very promising, and neither of which he finished. And so I did the first one called The Living Dead. Finished that. He had written a big portion of that, but not quite half, I would say. That came out in 2020, and the new one called Pay the Piper is a book that I ran across in his archives. Like shortly following his death, he all of his archives ended up at the University of Pittsburgh, and I was going through the archives just sort of because I wanted to, and the family knew me at that point. And that's
Yeah,
where I
you
ran
had him
across
in, huh?
Pay the Piper. Yeah, and Pay the Piper was a project that nobody really knew existed. Um,
Yeah, so walk me through that just because I mean, I feel like that's a story in itself, just the digging through the archives in Pittsburgh and then just finding something that nobody really, at least the common knowledge, didn't know that he was working on this particular book.
Yeah, I mean, The Living Dead, the previous book, was a book that he spoke about periodically in interviews, so everyone sort of knew that it was out there in some state. Pay the Piper was, I've not found anyone yet who knew of Pay the Piper. Um, and that could be because Suze reports to me that, Romero would work in these frantic bursts,
Hmm.
like he would stay up 24/7 for a week, and just write like mad and then kind of collapse. So it's very possible that this was a product of one of those frenzied work periods, and therefore, when it's something you're working on for a week rather than 2 years, it's probably easier for no one else to know about it. He sort of vomited out this really interesting first half of a book, and then for whatever reason tucked it away, and no one ever knew about it.
So you're a New York Times best-selling author yourself, and you have done many works. You've worked with directors outside of working with the estate here, Guillermo del Toro, another director you worked with on a couple things. Looking at somebody's work that's like halfway finished, were you looking at like this is a madman, or was this like this is incredible? Why did he stop, or like what made him stop, or was it stuff you had to kind of polish up because it was
Mhm.
such like a first draft type thing?
I think I know what made him stop in both cases. I think he was so used to writing screenplays. He wrote hundreds of screenplays. There are so many in his archive. Uh, there was a certain structure that he became used to with screenplays. There are certain rules, more or less, that he would hew to for screenplays. His interest in the novel seemed to be that you could sort of go wild. Like there wasn't
Ah.
a structure that was needed. And the good news is that he went wild. Like he would write these incredibly idiosyncratic and interesting half novels where he was going off on wild tangents and just being really entertaining, which is what you can't really do in a screenplay. But the downside of that is he just sort of kept adding characters, kept adding events, and he would at some point I think it would feel out of control to him, that his freedom had sort of led him out into the pasture somewhere, and that became my job. Then years later, is to take all those threads and find ways to tie them together. And he did leave some notes on the Living Dead, but he did not leave any notes on Pay the Piper.
So I mean, that had to be kind of a daunting task. Like what you're just saying. I mean, you take this brilliant work of a brilliant writer, director, and who's had, like, to use your words, I don't know, hundreds of screenplays or many screenplays. So he's no stranger to writing and going off on these tangents. And if you've seen his work, like where his mind is for certain things. Was it really hard though to like take that piece of work that is Pay the Piper and pull it back a little bit, formulate some character arcs, and make a cohesive story that people would just love?
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, I've done various other types of collaborations, and the two books with Romero, because he wasn't there, were the most difficult. I think even though Pay the Piper is probably my 26th book, maybe it pound for pound, it may be almost the hardest book that I've done, just because he threw so much strange stuff out there, and it's all so fascinating. But I had just no clue at first how to tie it up. So that meant I had to go on a mystery archaeological hunt through the manuscript he left for clues to where he was going with some of this. And eventually I did find those clues, but it was just really hard to do.
And I imagine what you were just saying, that like looking through the stuff, finding clues. I imagine that you only can pinpoint those things by writing as many novels as have you written, based because of how one goes about writing a book, where you set up things here to pay off later. Did that part of that
Yeah,
come into play?
I think that's probably very helpful to be well versed in novels. But again, it was difficult to know what he had planted that was supposed to bloom later, and what were just strange things that he just threw in spur of the moment. So I did go down various research routes that didn't result in anything. But then occasionally I'd go down a route that would reveal a whole lot. So it was a very unique challenge that I hope to never do again.
And if for folks that are not familiar, I mean, it's a supernatural horror story set in a cursed bayou of Louisiana, which by itself is kind of creepy in general. Then you throw in the whole the zombie world into it, and you have this tale that you have here.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear. Romero was known for zombies. He more or less created our modern understanding of zombies with Night of the Living Dead in 1968.
Yep.
Um, Pay the Piper is not a zombie book. In that sense, it's I think that's one of the reasons why his um, zeal to write it is all over the pages, because he felt really trapped by zombies. So most of those hundreds of scripts that I mentioned have no zombies. That's kind of what he wanted to do and was never really allowed to do. Pay the Piper is a horror novel,
Hmm.
and it has a trace of the other kind of zombie, the Haitian voodoo
Right.
style, just a little bit. And those kind of almost coincidentally are called zombies, without an E on the end. It's a different type of thing. A zombie astral is the term of
Mm.
uh, the the. I don't want to get into it too much, but
No,
it's
that's
in
fine.
Pay the Piper a little bit. But mostly, Pay the Piper is zombie free, and is a more I guess original uh, take on a completely new kind of folk horror type of monster lurking in the southern swamps.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a channeling their inner, Bad Moon Rising CCR type vibe.
Yeah,
Like I love that kind of stuff. There's been several books and movies that have been set in the bayous of Louisiana, and they always have this creepy tone to them, just based on the geographical landscape that forms that. So you throw in uh, George Romero and then yourself to create this story. That's kind of like you were saying. It's kind of a different vibe from him. It's not what people maybe colloquially know George A. Romero of. Oh, it's a zombie guy. Like you were saying, like this is different, and that's what makes it exciting, I think, for a lot of people, a lot of fans of his, a lot of fans of yours, to kind of go down this avenue together to kind of perhaps just start a whole new chapter. I imagine all those screenplays that you talk about. I'm sure some people were like, why don't we turn some of these screenplays into books or perhaps turned into movies later on. But it sounds like there's a wealth of the Romero knowledge still out there that perhaps could turn into something, and this is one of the examples of it.
Yeah, I think both of the two books that I've done are probably the first and best examples of things from the archives turning into real projects. These are the only two novels in the archives.
Sure.
Everything else is screenplays or treatments, and so those are actually much more straightforward types of things to adapt. You have a screenplay, you shoot the screenplay. That said, while I hope that does happen because there are some brilliant scripts in there, it is a little sad and unfortunate that he couldn't get these made when he was alive. So the books are a different story. Like he if he could have finished those, they would have been published. But it's a kind of a bittersweet thought that his scripts will eventually, some of them might get made by other people, which it's still nice to see, but I would have liked to have seen George been able to do something other than zombies. Really, his last couple decades of his life, really he couldn't even do a horror. He had to do a specifically zombie.
Right. I know, like you said, it's almost that thing where you create something so original and so brilliant that you kind of get pigeonholed into it when you want to do other things. Like you always hear, like child actors who never want to acknowledge that they're, like Ralph Macchio, maybe you never wanted to talk about Karate Kid. And then finally Cobra Kai comes along and he leans back into that. And all of a sudden it becomes this cultural thing again. I suppose that could be a little bit of what he faced in terms of like, hey, I can do all these other things. There's all these other genres of horror that I would like to tackle, but you guys just keep wanting, a zombie movie. And great, they made me who I am, but it speaks to the volume of scripts that were left, sadly, that he didn't get to finish. So it's got to be a little bizarre to be able to see those though, and see like this body of work up close and personal, where you're like holding it in the archives there in Pittsburgh, I imagine.
Yeah, it is. It's really cool to see all that stuff, really, and it gives you a much broader understanding of an artist. I mean, so many of us really get pigeonholed really early, just as you say. If you have some sort of success, that pressure to keep working in the same genre, or in Romero's case, like subgenre, is really strong. Like you get a lot of pushback. I know Wes Craven went through this. Like he was another horror director who really just wanted to make movies, just all sorts of movies, and he couldn't get out of the horror.
Nightmare on Elm Street kind of put him in, and Last House on the Left was another one of his early
and then
works.
He couldn't. He like Romero. Romero's archives are filled with westerns and dramas and mysteries and sci-fi, and it's been one of the. I think if I've succeeded in anything in my career, it's that I've managed to do the rare. It took me a long time, but I've managed to make not having a brand my brand, and that's really, really tough to do.
Sure,
to be able to move between genres and styles, and formats and age ranges. It's something that the system is set up to sort of discourage that.
And I imagine, though, it also makes you a better writer, just because you have to get in these different lanes where, okay, I'm doing horror now, then I'm doing this genre and that genre, and then like doing the research per each project that you work on. I imagine it's like it's like taking a crash course in college of like a specific genre, just so you can be an expert to write about it. So when you're writing about it, you know what you're talking about, which I always find so fascinating with authors when they write about anything that has a little history to it or sets in a place that is real, because people will call you out if you're not right. I mean, that's just the world that we live in now, right? So you kind of got to know what you're talking about to do that for each project. It's got to be exhausting, but also rewarding.
It's mostly rewarding. I mean, every time I switch genre or switch format or age range or whatever, it's like a wake up. It's like taking a shower. Writing in the same genre, or God forbid, like the same series of books. Like, if you're on book 19 of Detective Malone or whatever, I just don't understand how, I admire it in a way, but I don't understand how one could could keep writing in the same like piece of turf over and over again. But yeah, it is. I often call it like taking a crash course or a college course. You know, my book previous to this, Whalefall, which was about a diver who gets swallowed by a sperm whale, and has an hour of air to get out, and that was a great example of I didn't know anything about whales, and so I spent like 3 months just talking to whale experts and learning about what's possible, what scientifically could happen inside a whale, what is the biology like. And I think some authors maybe really hate research. I know they do because they tell me this. But I absolutely love research, and it's part of what changes up every project again because I have to kind of dump a lot of the information that's in my head and replace it with new information, which it might be a drag to some, but is like lifeblood to me.
Yeah, I imagine when you do all that research, it just makes you a better writer, versus, I mean, unless you're just one of those, like a savant who just knows a lot about everything and you can almost sound like you're an expert about everything. I'm sure there are people like that in the world that are authors that can just write, like because that just the way their brain works. And then there's others that were like, well, I can do that and also research. So it almost gives them like a superpower to like tell these stories, like Stephen King, for example, a writer that you read some of this stuff and you're like, how in the world did you know about any of this stuff without research? And some of the stuff he just knew, some of the stuff he just dreamt and, researched and met people. But much to what you're talking about, talking to experts about certain things can give you insight and also spur a tale in your head where you're like, I didn't know that, but that's going to be part of the book there.
Yes, I mean Stephen King has the benefit of having like research assistants
Right. Yeah.
who
Now,
will
but I'm talking like
research
back in the day, like when Carrie happened and all that stuff.
synthesize
Yeah.
what he needs to know. Um, yeah, and I know writers who have started to use AI for to sort of collect research and stuff, which I just think is a terrible idea.
That sounds
Um,
gross.
yeah, I mean I get it because it is a shortcut to learn about stuff, but it's in the searching and the analysis and in the trying to understand things that you truly understand them and stumble upon a million other things that are of equal or more interest and send you down new paths. Which, if you get someone to synthesize research for you, whether it's an AI or a real person, you just lose all that. Granted, it's a lot more work, but it creates better work, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you think about all the people that, back in the day before the internet, you go to the library and you do the work. You
Yeah.
dig through the stacks and you have piles and piles of stuff and you take notes of the piles and all the stuff, People do that similar now, even with the internet where you got certain pages that you have saved on your web browser to go back there and copy and paste and add to a document, the whole thing. I imagine the writing process for you has to be different than Romero or anybody else. Like, was it hard to adapt to hit the writing style, or did you just take it all and add it to your writing style and then formulated the book?
Yeah, it's kind of an in between thing. It was a little easier to pay the piper because I had done it already with Living Dead, and that was a giant book. So I'd spent hundreds and hundreds of pages already formulating how to work with his prose. So really, there's Romero had a writing style, and I had a writing style, and the way that Pay the Piper reads now is a sort of third style, which is like what it sounds like when he and I's styles are mixed. So essentially, I would go back and kind of revise what he did, and then that revision kind of became the new style that I would then continue to pursue for the rest of the pages that weren't there.
Is there anything that you'll take now going forward with you from this process? Is it like, has it evolved you as a singular writer?
Yeah, I think all the collaborations I do evolve you, and I think a lot of what I do in writing is I make sure that every single time I write a book now, I'm having to write in a new way. I think the worst thing that can happen in your career once you get into the 20s or 30s numbers of books you've written is you just start sounding like yourself. And so I purposely create problems and hurdles now. And some of that is just the topics. Like I don't know anything about the inside of a whale. I haven't spent that much time in the Louisiana Bayou. So you take these like details that you are going to have to master in some way. So research is one way to push yourself out of your safety, comfortable zones. Another one is collaboration because you're dealing with somebody else who has their own opinions and their own ways of telling stories. Sometimes it's more format, like I just wrote a book that is essentially all one sentence. So it's like new tasks, new challenges that force you to relearn how to write a novel, which is not what you want to do when you're on novel number 3 because you're still figuring it out. But after
Right.
a while, to keep yourself vital and to keep the books all feeling different, I find these challenges very helpful.
You mentioned that you weren't an expert in the whale marine biology area, or nor were you one in the bayou of Louisiana. Is it helpful for you when you write some of these things to go like to the bayou? Did you go down there, or did you go? I don't know. Do you visit whales? Like,
Yeah,
do you go to did you go to the shed and check or not the shed, but a place similar like the shed out on the coast somewhere, like to really see it for yourself?
yeah, I'm a big believer in going to the places if they exist and if you can get out there. I know not everyone can always make it. If you might be writing about some far flung country and you can't make it, and you have to
Sure,
deal
sure.
with what you've got. But yeah, I definitely went out to the Louisiana several times, went to the Bayou, went to the battle site of the Battle of New Orleans, which figures into the book. Um, as does the real life Pirates Lafitte. So kind of visited all the relevant locations there. For the same for the whale book. I couldn't get swallowed by a whale, but I could visit as many sites as I could. I could visit the beach where the story takes place.
Hmm.
And that stuff, it changes. It never fails to change the book radically when you do that. Like the sand, for example, the sand at the beach where Whalefall takes place is just not quite like sand that I've ever felt before. Now that's a tiny detail that hardly changed the book, but still, it gratifies me when I'm able to throw in these like little specifics that you would definitely not know unless you went there. And sometimes you visit these places and you see something that's so radically different than what it seemed to be in photographs and videos, if those things even exist. And you can turn your head and look and say, "Oh, look at that thing there that I never would have known was there. That's really cool and can somehow affect the plot."
Yeah, I think that's cool just from the reader's standpoint when you're reading something and you've been to the place that the author's writing about and they have those little nuggets. It's almost like you're part of a club that you almost don't want to tell people about, but you almost know, like, yeah, this guy's legit. Like, he's been there. He talked about the thing that you only know if you're there. You know what I mean? Or
Right.
she or whatever. You know what I mean? So
Yeah, it's
those.
like in Pay the Piper, I get that a lot with like people who are familiar with Cajun language, Cajun culture. Like that's something that's heavy in the book. And when you hear from Cajuns saying you got it right, that makes you feel good. Or if I hear from whale experts for Whalefall, or scuba divers who
Mhm.
say, "Hey, you got it right," like that's always really nice to hear. Really nice to hear because I work really hard on those things anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like we've only been talking here for a little while, but it sounds like you're kind of a one-man band type of when it comes to your research. I'm sure your family helps in certain ways, maybe that perhaps doesn't actually involve getting pen to paper, but living with them in general when you're an author who's got to run out and to do these research projects for novels like this. I imagine it's just a collaborative effort, though, but mostly a family affair or just yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think most writers who are below the Stephen King level are doing their research themselves. Um, but it is hard and it takes a long time. And if you're going to find primary sources, you know, you have to interview actual people. And those are all things that writers, for various reasons, may be disinclined to do. But I love reading something and knowing you can tell by the writing that this person did their work. And that is always very satisfying for me.
Well, and it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you here. And I just want to hold up the book, Pay the Piper. It came
Oh,
out on the 3rd of
let me
this
hold up
month.
my book because your
Oh,
book
yeah, I
has
have the advanced
you
copy.
just
I'm sorry.
have the temporary cover. This is the actual cover.
Ah,
Yes,
very cool.
Pay the Piper came out September 3rd.
And do you have a book event coming up?
I've got so many book events. The I don't think I have any more in Chicago,
Maybe you just
but
had one when I was reading the thing.
yeah, I was at Printers Row and had an event at
That's right.
Exile and Bookville last week. But if you go to my website, danielkraus.com, and click on news, that will have all my tour information.
And since it's just us fellas here talking for a second, you're in the Chicago area. What is one of your Chicago things that you like to do? Nothing to do with the book. Sorry, I
Yeah,
just always
sure.
ask people. But like, what do you like to do?
I mean, mostly I like to write. So normally I'm right here in my in my office in my house. Uh, I am sort of a hermit homebody, so I
Uh-huh.
don't do anywhere near as much as I should. But if there's one spot you're more likely to find me than others, it'd probably be the Hop Leaf in Andersonville, where
Oh yeah, oh, I've been there
I
many times.
yeah, me too, me too.
Very cool. Daniel, thank you so much for taking time to chat with me. Congratulations on I mean, you have a wonderful career going for you. You're in, like, would you say this is 26?
I think so. I know that I just am starting to write what will be my 30th book, so I think this is 26. Pay the Piper.
And I love the fact that you call Chicago home. It's very cool to have such great uh talent in Chicago. Last question and I'll stop bothering you for the day, I promise. Do you get any of your muse from the pulse or the people that you meet that make up Chicago, or do you go outside because this is home and you kind of want to keep it home?
It's I don't necessarily avoid it. I definitely don't try to keep things kind of church and state. I like to mix it up. It really depends on the book. If there's a book that takes place in a city and it's not important what city it takes place in, I would certainly be inclined to want to set it in Chicago. Other times you've got books that need to be on the coast or
Sure.
need to be in the middle of nowhere. So it really, I just let the story kind of tell me. But yeah, I mean, I love Chicago and will never leave, and so um, it surely will influence all present and future projects.
Well, I feel the same. And thank you again for taking time to chat with me. I appreciate it.
Hey, you got it.